guest speaker today, and to all of you as well. So I think we've got a critical mass hopping on here. So I think we'll get started with our usual kind of way of introducing our guest speaker that we have today, Dr. Jessica Fanzo. We're going to start with some fun facts about her. Now, she's now in New York, but her favorite food is, I would say, of the family of foods that lots of people in Maryland like. And so we'll invite guesses in the chat as to what her specific favorite food is. I can tell you it's going to be kind of hard. So Janice, you gotta go more specific for us. I don't see it yet. I still don't see it. So
Casey came close.
they're getting close. Let me see. Oh, Casey.
Marianne,
Yeah,
too.
Casey's getting close. Okay, think smaller. Think on the small side.
It's a bivalve.
Yeah. Christina. Well done, Christina. So do tell us about your love of clams. How do you like like to prepare these clams?
Well, I'm Italian, and so I really like what's called vongole, spaghetti alla vongole, which is spaghetti with clams, and garlic and white wine and little olive oil. It's absolutely delicious. Highly recommend it.
Yum. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Thanks for see, it was a little hard for people. I said there were a lot of, I'm getting kind of hungry looking if you weren't hungry already by the title of the talk today, but these are great guesses. So lots of us love, love film. Lots of us love going to the movies. What decade of films would you like to guess that Dr. Fanzo loves? Which decade? Okay. 80s. Oh, 40s. Okay. 60s. We should have people provide a representative example of from each of these decades. No one thinks the 2020s which is interesting, or the 2010s. Okay. So do you want to tell us about your favorite?
I think I must have said the 1970s, no?
You
did.
Did.
The great American decade of cinema. I think some of the best films ever made were during the 70s. The Godfathers, Apocalypse Now, Chinatown, Deer Hunter, just Easy Rider. Yeah, Mary. So many great films. And a time when, what we consider some of the most famous directors, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, they were all young and creative then, and were sort of had carte blanche on what they could make. So it was a really, Taxi Driver, an incredible time for cinema, a really creative time in American cinema. Yeah.
Very good. All right. So as our last fun fact, so we've had a number of jam session guests who have kind of a performing arts background of some sort. So I want you all to offer up, what do you think Dr. Fanzo has sort of participated in when it comes to performance? Oh, dancing, stand-up comedy. Okay, yeah. Glee Club. Glee Club is getting warm, maybe. I don't know. Theater, orchestra. Awesome. Playwriting, choir. Okay. All right. Do you want to share with us?
Deidre, what did I say? I don't
You
remember.
talked about a band that
Oh
you.
yeah, I have a band. Yeah, I'm in a band. It's called Sound Furies with my husband. It's kind of I think some people have classified it as like desert rock, which I think is a very strange. I wish it was punk, Mary, but I really appreciate everyone thinking that I'm talented. Playwriting, musical theater. I wish I was able to do all that, but no, I'm in a band called Sound Furies.
And
It's
what
fun.
do you sing? Do
I
you?
sing. I
Oh,
sing. Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you may be the first. We actually, I think we've had maybe one jam session speaker who actually is in a band. Actually, is actually in a band other than you. So you
Yeah,
may get a
we're trying
request.
to keep rock and roll alive because it's kind of a
That's good.
dying musical
That's good.
genre.
Feel free to drop examples in the chat. Well, very good. Thanks everyone for playing. We're gonna give Dr. Fanzo just maybe a 1 minute break and switch. We have a slide for something we really want to plug and sort of announce to you all, and then we're gonna come back to talk about Dr. Fanzo. So if I could get help with our slide we want to share. So while we have all of you on, we wanted to just let you know that we have a funding opportunity for early stage investigators that's available. So that's going to be people who are postdocs or junior faculty like instructors or assistant professors who are conducting health equity research, particularly that type of research that relates to chronic cardiometabolic health conditions. So things like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, kidney disease. Who are working in either Maryland or Washington, D.C. And this is our pilot program through our Mid-Atlantic Center for Cardiometabolic Health Equity, which lives, or MATCH for short, which lives within the Center for Health Equity. So we're going to drop here in a moment this the link to the where you can submit your letter of intent, which is a short little, it should take you just a couple of minutes to fill out online. A letter of intent. It's not a written, like with letterhead letter of intent that's due in 5 days. And then based upon if you're eligible, then you would be able to be invited to submit a full application. So we really hope to have a number of you to submit to that. So thank you for that moment. So we gave a break to our guest, and now I want to give a more formal introduction of Dr. Jessica Fanzo, who is was at Hopkins for a number of years as a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor, and is now Professor of Climate and the Director of the Food for Humanity Initiative at Columbia University's Climate School in New York City. She also serves as the Interim Director for the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. And she's been involved in a number of different endeavors, including the Food Systems Economic Commission, the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition Foresight 2.0 report, and numerous others, and is currently serving as co-chair of the Global Nutrition Report and the team leader for the United Nations high-level panel of experts on food systems and nutrition. So she has a real global focus, as you may have gleaned from the title for today. And we are really super excited to hear from her and to in some ways welcome her back to Hopkins. But so we will let you take it away. Welcome
Great.
again.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Deirdre, for the nice introduction, and thanks to the team that organized this, and of course thanks to Lisa Cooper, who's not here today, but it's great to at least be connected in this way with her again. I'll share my screen and I'll present probably for about 50 minutes, and then hopefully we can have some good discussion. And I'll be talking today about the complexities of ensuring sustainable diets for everyone. And hopefully you all can see my screen. So I think you all heard as you were coming on to the webinar, Sam Cooke, beautiful voice, sadly murdered at the age of 33. But, you know, he sang this song, a change is going to come. And he was positioning as being the Bob Dylan of soul music, and really speaking to the civil rights issues that he was living through at the time. And I often think about that song because we're still wondering when that change is going to come. When are we going to see more equity? Are we going to be able to change our food systems and our health systems so they benefit everybody? So to me, I'm always not only inspired by his music and his lyrics and his beautiful voice, but his message is so pivotal and so important in now, even though this was over 50 years ago that he wrote this song. So today I'll talk with you about what motivates us to do research on food systems. So I'll walk you a bit through what we're seeing, what's the state of food systems around the world. Why do we need them to transform? Why do we need to understand them better? And then I'll talk a bit about some sticky issues that stymie progress in transforming food systems. And then I'll go into some of the work we're doing from the global to the local level. So what is a food system? I thought I'd start here just to define what do we mean when we mean a food system? And this is a pretty busy diagram, but let me walk you through it. So this gray box here in the middle is a food system. Food is produced on landscapes. It's stored, it's packaged, it's processed, it's transported to markets and restaurants around the world. And these are what we call food supply chains. We are individuals, you can see here, and we interact with the food system multiple times a day. We make choices in that food system. We bring our information and knowledge. We bring our values, our aspirations, our preferences, our purchasing power, and our cultures to those food systems. And the way we engage in the food system are these food environments. This is a market, a restaurant, a bodega. You walk into these environments and you are deciding what to purchase or order. These food environments can very much shape your diets and your choice. What kind of food is available? Is the food affordable? What are the food product properties, their quality, their appeal, their convenience, the vendor properties, the advertisement? All of these factors can influence your decision-making power in positive and negative ways. And when you look over here on the right, we want our food systems to do a lot. We want them to have benefits for the environment. We want them to have better nutrition and health outcomes, economic outcomes, fair livelihoods, and equity. But food systems don't sit in isolation. They interact with other systems like the health systems and intimate dances. And they're driven by many different factors that shape and shift these food systems in different directions. Politics, population growth, migration, conflict, globalization and trade, climate change, urbanization. All of these drivers are influencing the direction and dynamism of food systems. So what motivates us to undertake food systems research in the context of climate change? And I think, everyone would agree with me that thinking about any kind of systems research without thinking about climate change is a bit naive now. We're all impacted by a changing climate and the variability of our climate. And every system has implications in the climate agenda. So one of the big issues that we are dealing with is climate change. And the way we are living our lives, our human activity is having profound impacts on climate change. The way we are growing our population, our consumption patterns, be it energy, water, transportation, all of these human footprints are having significant impacts on climate change. And what we see when we look at some of the big climate responses It's not a great picture. On the top are the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, all significantly increasing since the 1960s, but spiraling quickly into an upward trajectory in the last decade. We see that ocean heat is rising. The acidification of the ocean is getting more acidic. Sea levels are rising. The ice masses across the Arctic, Greenland, and Antarctica are declining, and we're seeing significant deforestation. So the climate responses, because largely due to our human activity, is not a positive picture now and into the future. Now, what does this all mean for food systems? Well, I'm going to talk about how food systems are victims of climate change. They are problems for climate. They contribute to the problem of climate change, but they can also be a solution. Now, when we think about the impacts of climate on food production, just can we produce enough food to feed the world? It's a mixed picture. This is a graph showing you some of the major crops: maize, corn, wheat, soybean, and rice, and showing you in a business as usual, taking no action on climate. When you look across the latitudes of the earth, you see changes in yield. And one of the big impacts is on corn. United States grows a lot of corn. A lot of South America and Latin America grows a lot of corn, as does sub-Saharan Africa. And what you see is this orange bump is a decline in maize production. And the gray is where maize is grown. So in the places where maize is grown around the world, we're going to see declines in yields of that. Now, wheat will also see declines in the southern latitudes, but we could potentially see increasing yields of wheat. Same with soy and same with rice. The problem is we need to grow those foods in other places in the world, in the northern latitudes, if we want to not impact the yields of those crops. We also know that climate is having a significant impact on the nutritional quality of crops. So when we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what's called a CO2 fertilization effect, with some crops, we see declines in protein, iron, and zinc, all very critical nutrients for growth and development. And you can see in these maps the places that will be particularly impacted by this CO2 fertilization effect, in which some plants will see declines in the nutrient content of these crops, which is quite alarming. Now, that's projecting out 2050. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about long-term projections. But right now, we're facing pretty extreme weather events due to climate variability and the warming planet. And the question is are we ready? Are we prepared? We know that droughts, floods, cold spells, hurricanes, wildfires are all contributing to significant upheaval of populations. I mean, this picture showing you last summer. This is the Greek wildfires. Here's the Vermont floods. The southwestern part of the United States was under massive heat constraints, as was droughts in East Africa and heat spells in South Asia with flooding. Are we prepared for these extreme events? We know that last year was the hottest year on record. Last summer was the hottest summer on record, and likely the coldest summer you will have experienced. So it will only get hotter. And food systems are vulnerable to these extreme events. When we look at climate and weather shocks, geopolitical shocks, policy changes, when we look across crops, livestock, fisheries, and aquaculture, the darker red is showing you the shock frequency that's impacting these groups of food commodities. And we see that here on the bottom, the frequency is increasing over time. We're seeing higher concentrations of shocks, particularly extreme weather events, particularly within that droughts, that are impacting the ability for us to grow enough food to feed a growing population. So food systems are vulnerable to many of these shocks. And of course, we know another big shock are conflict. We're dealing with many conflicts around the world right now that can decimate food security and the ability to move food and trade it around the world. So that's the victimization of food systems, but they also contribute to climate change and environmental degradation. When we look at food systems, 30% of greenhouse gas emissions produced are coming from food systems. That's a lot. A third of the total greenhouse gas emissions around the world are coming from our food system. Most of that sits in these two buckets: agriculture production and land use change. Now, most of those emissions are coming from methane, a greenhouse gas, a quite toxic greenhouse gas coming from cattle. They're enteric fermentation, they're burping up methane, methane from rice paddy systems, emissions from manure and pasture management, and land use change, that being deforestation. In addition to that, food systems are contributing to fresh water resource declines. Agriculture uses about 70% of the world's fresh water resources, and agriculture is the #1 contributor to biodiversity loss in both animals and plant species. But if 6 economies were to take action, the EU, Indonesia, India, US, Brazil, and China, we could make significant impacts in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because these 6 economies contribute about half of the world's food system greenhouse gases. So it's not all doom, in that if these 6 economies were bold and took action, we could see big impacts, positive impacts in addressing the food system contributions. Another reason we're inclined to do more research in food is that diversity and the lack of diversity of our food system is putting us at significant climate risk and nutrition risk. We have over 5,500 crops that we can consume, but 50% of our calories are coming from just 3 crops: rice, corn, and wheat, which is incredible. So we see a lot of issues around this homogenization of our food system. And we saw this when Ukraine and Russia went to war, 2 major breadbasket countries that predominantly produce wheat. When they went to war, we saw a global food price crisis due to this lack of diversity, in which wheat really influenced the ability across market speculation, food inflation. So just 2 countries going to war, producing 1 major commodity, has upheaval across the food system. And what we've seen is a big loss of some of these local varieties and traditional crops. This top box is showing you Asia and Africa, and most of the farmland was growing local varieties of crops, indigenous crops from those regions. And now, 40 years later, the red is showing you that most of the land is being used to grow these modern varieties that lack genetic diversity. So this puts the food system at incredible risk when we rely on a handful of crops to feed the world. Another issue is that the kinds of foods that we grow is putting significant pressure on the environment. Now, what this is showing across different food groups are in colors, and it's showing you the pressure to grow these foods and of different environmental stresses. So as you can see on the top is greenhouse gas emissions, where ruminant animals, beef and lamb, contribute a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, along with pork and poultry. Same with land use change. The ruminant animals are the biggest converter of land use change, along with some milk and a few other commodities. But other crops, be it fruits and veg, nuts, use a lot of water, and they also pollute waterways, nitrogen and phosphorus application, what's called eutrophication. So depending on the kind of food, where it's grown and how it's grown, can have different environmental impacts across the world. So while livestock, cattle, very energy and resource intensive, again, depending on the crop, take avocados being very water intensive, they can have different environmental stresses. And that's the production side. Now, if we go to the other side of the food system, what we consume, we have the farm to the fork. Our diets also matter. So this is showing you, and this is work from Brent Kim and colleagues in the Center for Livable Future at Hopkins. They've done some fantastic work looking at US diets, different dietary patterns, and the per capita greenhouse gas emissions from these different diets. And again, the colors are different food groups. So the typical omnivorous diet, which you consume meat, you consume dairy, very varied diet, you can see the greenhouse gas footprint. As compared to on the other end of the chart, you see the vegan diet, much lower greenhouse gas footprint. And along the whole middle here is a whole range of footprints coming from different types of diets. So the kind of diets that we choose or the kind of diets we have access to have different environmental footprints. Another reason we want to research food systems is that we're seeing significant changes in the kinds of foods available. And these foods are not optimal for human health. What we see is massive growth of what are called ultra-processed foods. These foods are high in sugar, salts, and unhealthy fats, have lots of ingredients, additives that allow for them to be stored on shelves for a long time, traded across oceans. They're tasty, convenient, and cheap. These foods, the evidence is growing that they are very detrimental to a number of health outcomes. And we're seeing the sales of these foods proliferate around the world. And this is significant cause for concern of how we begin to even regulate these types of foods, which are ubiquitous across the global food supply. And what's resulting is that we're seeing diets become a major risk factor of death and disease. This is work that we did with the Global Burden of Disease Project, demonstrating that dietary risks are one of the top risk factors. But if you look at these top 5 risk factors of death, 4 of these 5 are related to diets: blood pressure, high fasting plasma glucose, high body mass index, and of course, the kinds of foods we eat, the dietary risk. And most of this death is now by non-communicable diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke. So diets, which are meant to nourish us, are actually now killing us. And this has resulted in significant burdens of malnutrition all over the world, and largely malnutrition is worsening. So we see that 735 million people go to bed hungry every night. That number's been growing for the last 5 years. We still see a significant burden of children who are undernourished. About 23% of children under the age of 5 are chronically undernourished or stunted. 45 million children under the age of 5 are acutely malnourished or wasted. And 2.2 billion adults are overweight or obese. This burden is just massive. And the question is why is it not improving when other global health statistics, maybe taking away the pandemic, like child mortality, is actually coming down? Why are we not seeing the same progress on nutrition? And this map is showing you the number of people in food crisis around the world. A lot of people are struggling with food insecurity. And we're seeing this escalate, particularly in places where there's a lot of conflict. And the last reason we want to do research in food systems is that there's really 2 points to this slide. If we take no action on food systems, we will not meet the Paris climate change targets to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we fix the energy sector, transportation, buildings, and we take no action on food, we won't meet the Paris climate change targets. And what this graph shows you is this bottom hatched line. To have a fighting chance of staying below 1.5, we need to do multiple things. We need to increase our efficiency of agriculture, increase yields in some parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa. We need to move towards a plant-dominant diet and consume a healthy amount of calories. And we need to cut food loss and waste in half. But all of these actions don't quite get us to staying below 1.5. We need to do all of this combined implementation, if we want to stay below the 1.5 degree target. But to fix food systems is incredibly complex. There's so many activities. There's so many feedback loops and trade-offs, millions of actors from multinationals to small scale. There's a lot of politics in these systems. This is very, very complex to deal with. And what do we mean by transforming food systems, ensuring they're more resilient? Well, that can mean many things. Of course, we want to ensure that food is available, accessible, affordable, sufficient, nutritious, desirable, and safe for everyone. We want our food to be produced from sustainable environmentally sustainable and resilient systems. We want those who are working in food systems to have fair and equitable livelihoods. And we want our food systems to benefit nature. But when you ask communities what they want from their food systems, you'll get different responses. Community, reciprocity, racial equity, inclusive, participatory, generosity, sovereignty. So many different people have different visions of how food systems can be transformed towards resilient food systems. So what issues limit food system transformation? I'm just going to highlight a couple, and then I'll talk about some of our research. One issue we have is that some countries and individuals need to make larger changes to their diets if we are to benefit the whole of society. So my argument is that energy-intensive lifestyles and dietary choices of some living in high-income countries are significant anthropogenic contributors to climate change. Just look at this graph. This is the consumption of different animal source foods, all more energy and environmentally intensive. Look at the United States and their consumption versus Kenya, Cambodia, Senegal, Ethiopia. There's a huge disparity in who gets access to certain foods, which in small amounts can be beneficial to growth and development, but people just don't get access to them in some places. Where in the US and the UK and Brazil, we're consuming way more animal source foods than we need for our human health and our nutritional needs. I was part of something called the Eat Lancet Commission that promoted a more plant-dominant diet, so more fruits and veg, whole greens, plant oils, and plant source proteins like legumes, nuts, and seeds. And what we see is that globally, if this is the Eat Lancet recommended diet boundary, around the world, we see people going way beyond the boundary for meat consumption and starchy staples, and not enough of the healthy ingredients of a diet. Again, the fruits, veg, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Look at North America, a lot of meat, potatoes, eggs, dairy, and not enough of the fruits and veg. And here's sub-Saharan Africa, not enough of the healthy stuff, but a lot of starchy staples. Just look at the inequity here between sub-Saharan Africa and North America. Really, really incredible contrast. The second issue is, how do we best use finite resources when we still have hunger around the world? Now, if you just look at this graph, about 50% of all the land on the planet is used to grow food. Of that 50%, about 75% is used to raise livestock for meat and dairy. 23% is towards plant crops. But of that 75% growing livestock and dairy, that only contributes about 18% of calories and about 37% of protein. So it's not contributing a lot to our diets as compared to the plant foods. The question is, because of the intensity that livestock bear on natural resources, is this the best use of a finite resource, that being land? And what we don't want to do is start extensifying into other landscapes, going beyond that 50%. Because what has happened is we are extensifying. We are growing food, particularly in places that are very biodiverse and fertile, and that's forests. Forests act as a carbon sink. They capture carbon from the atmosphere, so they are protective for us and the planet. But what we see is that with expansion of livestock, we're decimating these forestscapes, these tropical forests that you see in the Amazon, for example, the Congo Basin in Africa. And cattle is the #1 driver of tropical deforestation, with oil seeds, that being soy and palm, being the second driver. So we really want to avoid this massive deforestation loss, because we lose that carbon sink and we lose that rich biodiversity, and we lose those homes that so many indigenous populations depend on. The third sticky issue is who governs our food system. This is a growing concern. We know that there's massive concentration and consolidation of actors across food supply chains. So we've got 1.5 billion food producers, farmers. We have 8 billion consumers. But along the middle part of that value chain or supply chain, the traders, the beverage processors, the retailers, we see significant concentration of a handful of companies and multinationals controlling those supply chains. We also see it at the seed level, the farm machinery level, the fertilizer level. So these transnational food and big ag companies are well coordinated. They have a ton of economic power and political power, and they often are in control of the food system. And this is highly problematic when we want our governments to step in and protect public health, protect the environment, when they have such little power as compared to some of these big companies. And you're seeing more and more of this. This is showing you the top 4 firms, or what are called the CR4, for selected US commodities. So for example, here at the top, beef processing, JBS, Tyson, Marfrig, and Cargill. JBS and Marfrig are Brazilian companies. These 4 companies control 73% of beef processing. That's a lot of power and concentration across food systems. So this is a big ethical conundrum that we face. So I'm going to spend the last about 25 minutes talking about what we're doing, the kind of research we're undertaking to deal with some of these challenges, and really focusing on how do we better integrate climate research, food systems, and some of the health research at different scales. And I'll first talk at the global level, what we're working on, and then the national level work, and some of the local work that we're doing. So on the global scale, we've been doing a lot of work, and it's a little bit sloggy, but prioritizing and framing food systems in climate and international development global agendas. So international development, global governance around major challenges that the world is facing now, it's a very crowded space. Right now, we're dealing with massive amounts of conflict and issues related to that. Half the world almost will be voting this year. About 4 billion people will be voting for their democracies this year. So we're in a very fragile place in international development. Food systems have always been deprioritized, but with climate variability and change, with the ongoing wars and the post-pandemic economic downturn, more policymakers are looking at food systems as being a lever for change. So we're trying to gear some of this global research to better inform policy and programs to try to address more resilient food systems. And we work through some of these large decades of action moments, like the COP meetings, that's the climate meetings, the UN Systems Summit that happened in 2021 and is still ongoing, the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, et cetera. And for the last several years, we've done a lot of work trying to improve food policy through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals, working on SDG 2. And a lot of that work was fine, but insufficient. It really didn't take a food systems lens. So more and more over the last several years, we've established this notion of food systems and their political relevance for human and planetary health. There's been a number of very high-level reports by different UN agencies. We've had the Global Nutrition Report, the High-Level Panel of Experts report, which really put into place guidelines for policymakers to address food systems and really built the case that governments need to start paying attention to their food systems. And we've done a lot of that. We've established some of the evidence-based and scientific targeting for food systems transformation. I'm just putting some of these up. You can all read these if you're interested, around issues of innovation, issues of artificial intelligence, the importance of aquatic foods. There's my clam reference. There you go. And really trying to establish the evidence base for how we can transform food systems and how that would benefit human society. And some of the lessons over the last several years is that if you flood the landscape, the political landscape, you can garner attention. But that attention is often transient and temporary. You really need to stay the course. So while food systems have reached quite a high priority, policymakers often don't know how to navigate such a complex system like a global food system or even national food systems. And they're often unaware of the trade-offs and which levers to invest in. So providing data for policymakers is so important if you want their decision-making to be evidence-based. And while global governance matters for food systems, there's a real need for local context. There's tons of different food systems around the world, very diverse. There's not a one solution. So you really need to drill down to the local context, the local governance, the local solutions, the local communities, if you want them to reap benefits and be able to adapt. So that takes us really to working at the national level and building decision-making tools for better food systems, evidence and action. And so that's really what we've been doing a lot of work on. We've tried to build better data tools, metrics, and models to help policymakers unpack some of these complex food system challenges they're facing. Because policymakers are often navigating in the dark. They don't know how their food systems are performing, what are the risks, what are the climate risks on their food systems, and where and how to intervene, and who's most vulnerable. So I'm going to present to you two projects we have. One's the Food Systems Dashboard, and one's the Food Systems Countdown Initiative, in which we hope we are starting to help policymakers move into the light and out of the darkness. One is this Food Systems Dashboard. I've put the URL on the slide. And what it does is it brings together data from multiple sources in very easy to digest visual tools that help countries understand the state of their food system and how their food systems are performing, and what are some actions they can take in the areas where they see challenges. So we have a whole range of different tools on the dashboard. You can look at maps, you can look at country profiles, you can look at policy actions, and we really are trying to describe food systems, diagnose those food systems, and decide on better food system action through this dashboard. So we have mapping tools, and it's very easy to navigate. You do not have to be data savvy to play with the dashboard and understand how food systems are faring in this complex world. Now, the other project we have is the Food Systems Countdown Initiative, which is a collaborative effort to monitor food systems change and performance over the next 8 years, the deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. And we're trying to monitor food systems so we can hold governments to account and suggest where there's challenges, where there's positive progress on food systems. And what this is it brings together about 65 food system scientists from around the world, representing every region of the world, and 32 organizations from civil society, academia, the UN. And we've put these 65 scientists into 5 working groups: diets, nutrition and health, environment, natural resources and production, livelihoods, poverty and equity, and then 2 cross-cutting areas of resilience and governance. And what these groups did is they came up with a set of indicators that the world could track over the next 8 years. And we have 50 indicators. So it's a monitoring framework for food systems around the world. And this is showing you the 50 indicators across those 5 areas. And let me just blow up one. Here's on diets, nutrition, and health. We have about 10 indicators. And what you can see is high-income countries are in dark blue, low-income are in light blue. So just take this indicator here, prevalence of undernourishment. Low-income countries are struggling still with dealing with hunger. Where interestingly, high-income countries are not doing well on soft drink consumption, ultra-processed food sales, the cost of a healthy diet. So what this shows is that high-income countries are not always doing better than low-income countries. It really depends on which indicator you're looking at. We also have country patterns and regional patterns where you can explore the data by the 50 indicators by a country or by region. And this is showing you regional data. And just again, to blow that up, this shows you the diets, nutrition, and health, some of the indicators. And for example, here you can see that Oceania and North America are not doing well on ultra-processed food sales, whereas Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia are not doing well on addressing undernourishment. So again, it really depends region by region, country by country, on how food systems are performing. So a lot of the work that we've done looking at national food system science and trying to improve data to monitor food systems performance, we realize that no single region, no single country in the world has a monopoly on food system successes or on food system challenges. Every region has significant room for improvement, and countries can learn from each other, particularly when they're in the same region. Some countries are doing better than others. We know that if we don't monitor food systems that show strengths and weaknesses, countries will struggle to find a way forward of how to improve their food systems. And we still have a lot of gaps. There's a lot of data gaps. We can't show everything. We don't have a lot of real-time data, particularly on impacts of climate shocks on food systems, impacts of warfare on how food systems are faring in those situations. So we need more evidence, of course, and data to better capture how food systems are performing. And then the last area that I'll focus on is the local foodscapes, which is really where the rubber meets the road. How are local food systems influencing healthy and sustainable diets? Now, this is work that's been going on for a long time in my group, in which we're trying to understand how geography, place, land, rural, urban scapes are influencing what and where food is grown, the biodiversity of that food, and how that food then becomes available and accessible to communities and individuals. We know that there's a range of drivers that are influencing people's ability to access healthy and sustainable diets: geopolitics, climate change, urbanization, migration, population pressure. It's all influencing how people are able to access their diets. So we're trying to undertake some field level research to better understand how place influences the health and sustainability of diets around the world. Now, just to frame this, 3.2 billion people, 3.2 billion people, about 45% of the world's population, cannot afford a healthy diet. Isn't that incredible? So we're really dealing with significant inequities. So we've done a lot of work trying to understand how people are accessing diets. Are they environmentally sustainable? And some work we're doing in South and Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. We're looking in these countries because these places are rapidly changing and urbanizing. And some of the geographic places that were once rural, where many communities depended on those places, are changing and changing their ability, their kinds of foods they can access, less traditional diets, moving much more towards processed packaged foods. So there's a whole range of papers that we've been publishing trying to understand how diets are changing in this rapidly urbanizing context. We're also doing a project looking in Cambodia, particularly along the Mekong River. And this was work by Sweta Manohar, who's a Hopkins graduate, who's now at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Shauna Downs, who is at Rutgers, and some PhD graduates from Hopkins, Elizabeth Graham, Lais Miachon, and some of our Cambodian colleagues, trying to understand how the Mekong River as a food environment, this moving, dynamic food environment, is changing based on climate change, based on dam infrastructure, how this is impacting lower Mekong River communities, their food security, their ability to access aquatic foods, foods traded on the Mekong River. So this is a project that we have going on as a wild food environment, that being a river, and looking at the implications of food security in the lower Mekong. Now, the Mekong River is shared by 5 countries. So the question is, when there's dams built upstream in China or Laos, who governs that river? Who governs the ability for that river to remain intact to ensure that people can still benefit from those rivers downstream? It's a big political issue. Another area of work that we've been doing is trying to understand how Indigenous communities are coping with change, particularly climate change. And we've been doing a lot of this work in India, led by Suparna Ghosh Jarath, and other colleagues, again, Shauna Downs, Ruth DeFries, who works with me at Columbia. We're looking at how traditional diets of these Indigenous communities in India are changing, with more or less reliance on forestscapes, local food sheds, and these diets in some of these places which were very highly protected Indigenous food places are significantly changing, moving much more towards processed foods, less reliance on these naturescapes, and moving much more towards more of the industrialized food systems. We've also been looking a lot and working with very vulnerable populations, that being herders or pastoralists, people that roam with their animals. So we've done some work in Mongolia with colleagues, trying to understand some of the challenges that these herders or pastoralists are facing in the context of climate change. Now, in Mongolia, they have zuds, these terrible winters in which many of their livestock die. And so they're really facing these extreme cold events in Mongolia more than ever. And then in the next season, massive heat stress and drought. So how are these herders and even vegetable producers in Mongolia coping with some of these climate change factors? And so we've been really working with the communities to capture their perceptions, their constraints, their needs, and how they can better adapt to climate change and how it's impacting their diets. We're also doing this in northeastern Kenya with pastoralists, trying to understand through ethnography and photo voice studies, again, what are the constraints that they're facing, that they feel they're facing, that's making it very hard for them to adapt to climate change. These communities are really struggling in the face of drought and extreme events, and becoming increasingly reliant on food assistance and moving away from their traditional diets. So when we look at the lessons from local foodscape work, although global work matters, where it really becomes important is at the community level. And we see in resource-constrained, climate-vulnerable settings, there's increasing challenges that communities are facing in accessing healthy diets. That's not only physical access, where the food is, how far it is for them to get to, but the economic access and the social access, the culturally relevant, freedom from social barriers and stigma. So we're seeing this access to food, economic, physical, and social access being very constrained in some settings, particularly in low-income contexts. Just quickly, this is some of my team who's produced this work. A lot of women, only one sole fellow, Quinn Marshall. A lot of these people have been at Hopkins. Actually, all of them were once at Hopkins. Graduate of Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health or postdocs. Some of them have come with me to Columbia. Some of you may know Kate Schneider, who's still at Johns Hopkins. She's at SAIS. She teaches some fantastic classes on food systems and ag. I fully encourage you to reach out to her. She's a superstar. So some of this is the core team that really did all the work on this. We also have a lot of incredible collaborators on some key projects, some of which I didn't present today. Here's the countdown, which involves about 60 people, our dashboard team. We have a people-centered food systems human rights project that I didn't present today that is quite incredible, working on integrating human rights into food policy in 4 countries, Ethiopia, Uganda, Cambodia, and Honduras. And then our pastoralist projects. This is our funding. We mainly get our funding from UN, from foundations, Bill and Melinda Gates. The Stavros Niarchos Foundation was very pivotal in doing some of this work. Some governments, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Rockefeller Foundation. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Fanzo. And I want to apologize. I'm in transit, so my camera will be off, but I want to thank you for a really wonderful talk, and thank you even more for the work that you're doing, because obviously it affects all of us. So certainly appreciate what is really a mammoth and topic. So I want to open things up for folks. If you have questions for Dr. Fanzo, please, you can either raise your hand or you can put them in the chat, and we will try to get to them. It looks like, and I see Maya had a comment earlier. You might see in the chat there, just about when you were talking about ultra processed foods earlier. Maybe as people are thinking of their questions, one that I had, given that we have certainly an audience today of people who mostly are working locally, and I thought, when you sort of were tracing through your more global, national, and then local work, where do you see some of the like research that many of us are doing at a local level? Like what types of questions or data would be helpful for making the case for these what of course need to be certainly national and global efforts? Like what do you I guess think of in that way that maybe many of us who are in today to think about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, again, I think the local is what informs the global. Having worked at both spectrums, and I would say my team works much more at the local level, and I've somehow been stuck in the global, which is not very rewarding, I must say. We could talk about that if anyone wants to talk about careers but I think that local work of understanding, let's take, for example, what people are eating in the local context and what are some of the constraints around people's access to food. Understanding that local is what informs the global. And that it's so important to keep understanding the constraints and the inequities, because our world is so rapidly changing. Look what's happening in some parts of the world that wasn't happening a couple of years ago. So, I feel that one of the big things we need to really better understand is what are actually people eating around the world? Why are they making certain choices? When are those choices limited? Some people have more choice than others. What are the constraints for some people who don't have the time to eat healthy all the time, and certainly climate change is not high on their priorities when they're facing day-to-day constraints. We need to better understand how communities are coping. And that's why I really like that work that we did in Mongolia and northeastern Kenya. We worked hand in hand with those communities, and they drove the research. They provided the evidence of what they think the challenges are, not us going into their homes or households and asking them a bunch of dietary questions. We put the instruments into their hand, and they captured what they feel are their constraints. And I find that to be incredibly powerful. More and more of this community-led research. Yeah, so I feel that local level work is so key, because if you're working at the global level, you're never going to get down to really the brass tacks of localized solutions that benefit communities. So I think that's where it matters to be staying very grounded in what are the community needs.
Yeah, it looks like Maya has a number. Maya, would you like to ask a question about your comment here?
So it's really just kind of thinking about the ways in which women like whether we're talking about local context or internationally, women who are unfortunately living in under-resourced countries, when we think about gendered power dynamics and structural violence and their abilities to navigate food systems and be able to access high quality nutrition for themselves and their families. There definitely is some multidimensional and multi-layered dynamics that your presentation, Dr. Fanzo, brought to mind today, and just made me think about, in terms of a research perspective, there's lots more to do. There's lots more to do in terms of interventions, but I think there's lots to do for us in terms of advocacy as well. And then too, when I thought about you mentioning your funders as well, I think there's some interesting perspectives we can think about too, in terms of advocating for interagency partnerships around funding this type of work as well. So not really a specific question, just more of a comment about the complexity of the issue and how we'll need to think about some really creative ways to tackle it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Maya. Really insightful. And, and a lot of the work that we do across food, I mean, so many women are engaged in the food system, for example. And, we're talking about gendered power dynamics. That can mean a lot of things, but, a lot of the work that we do is with women because so many women are smallholder farmers and they don't get access to innovations, knowledge, technology, help, assistance, right? And they often are the ones who, when they do garner more income, they invest it in the household. They particularly invest it in their children, in their well-being. But women are completely constrained. The pastoralist setting in northeastern Kenya, we work with different groups, the Borana, the Turkana, and the Somali Kenyans. And the Somali Kenyan women really struggle. A lot of structural issues of their place in society, where they sit in kind of a hierarchy of men, animals, children, women. Some of the constraints that they face from a health perspective, a food perspective, a culture perspective, really challenging. Yeah. So, we're constantly, our entry point is usually with women in the work that we do in these low income contexts and in low income countries. Yeah, but I completely resonate with your thoughts on that. Yeah. I'm looking, Janice, do you want to talk about your, yeah, please.
Share, Janice.
I don't know if Janice, do you want to
Oh,
say?
yes, I was just saying that thank you
Please,
so
yeah,
much. It
share.
was a
Yeah.
great presentation. I'm sorry I cannot be on the camera at this point. Yeah, I'm really interested in like environmental health and nutrition. So I really appreciate how your research combines that in a unique way. And yeah, I hope to one day investigate immigrant diets and seeing how they evolve as people spend more time in the US, maybe across generations and stuff like that. So maybe I'll get to work with you at some point.
That'd be nice. Yeah, and Janice, I mean, it's in Ghana, it's interesting because Ghana has a very rich food culture. I've been to Ghana several times. And you look across, it's interesting when you look across Africa, while starchy staples make up a good portion of the diet in many places, and it's obviously changing based if you're in a rural area or an urban area of West Africa. African diets are still somewhat sustainable as compared to, say, the American diet, right? Or the Brazilian diet or the Australian diet. In sub-Saharan Africa, you see a grain as the major part of your plate, and you see some, pumpkin leaves or cassava leaves and some tomatoes and onions and some beans. Maybe there's meat on the plate, but it's interesting when you look at some of the African diets. It's what America's striving to get more towards. Maybe not so much starchy staple, but definitely more of the traditional leafy greens and things like that. But we know that in Africa, the diet's changing very fast, as is the epidemiology, where many of the African countries are facing these double burdens of malnutrition. So that will be your challenge, Janice, is how can Africa avoid what happened in the United States? Our diets are highly processed. We have massive issues with obesity, non-communicable disease. How can Africa leapfrog over those issues? That will be the challenge and the opportunity for the continent.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great. Other questions? Dr. eBay, would you like to want to share a comment verbally or?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Fanzo. That was an outstanding presentation. It's hard to say that I enjoyed it because a lot of what was, pretty sobering, but as I mentioned in my previous comment, I'm really inspired by the work you're doing and the methods that you're drawing upon to do your work. And I was just reflecting on what Janice said. So as I mentioned in the chat, my parents are from Nigeria, and to your point about kind of the preponderance of starchy foods in traditional Nigerian cuisine, one of the ways that they've tried to get around that is by substituting some of those traditional items with things that they know in this country or have learned from living here to be healthier. And I think some of that behavior is actually starting to um, it's making its way to Nigeria. So the illustration I gave in the chat was pounded yam. I personally love pounded yam.
Yeah.
Haven't fully converted to the healthier options, and I'll eat it with my parents, but in my heart of hearts, I like the original foods, but
Yeah.
so they have replaced pounded yam with oatmeal. And then gari, which I think it's made from cassava leaf. They've also used that in favor of pounded yam, which is it's much starchier and it's just not as healthy as some of the other things that I just mentioned. But I think alongside what Janice is saying and alongside what you said, it will be fascinating to see if exposure to increased knowledge about what constitutes a healthier diet might also influence what happens in the sub-Saharan African context with respect to lifestyle modifications around what foods are considered desirable and acceptable, and even reflecting on the fact that we often think of things like globalization or immigration as necessarily harmful, but what if it could also help promote healthier attitudes and increase in knowledge about things that are supportive or like conducive to, a good healthy lifestyle. So something I was reflecting on is in thinking of Janice's comment and some of the things that you mentioned earlier. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The Nigerian cuisine is having sort of its moment right now.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of like incredible Nigerian foods. I mean, it's a big country and very, it's so diverse. I mean, the okra, all the different ways of using okra and even the traditional using, and they use it in Ghana too, the palm oil, the red palm oil. That unfiltered palm oil, it's actually quite healthy as compared to the refined perfume palm oil that you see in Southeast Asia, that is no longer red. It doesn't have any vitamin A in it anymore. So I think, that it's an interesting, your comments are interesting because there is a new program by the State Department of the US called VAX. It's a terrible acronym, but it's Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils. It sounds like it should be a vaccination program. But what it's doing is it's trying to promote massive investment in agriculture R&D on the traditional crops around around the continent. So traditional crops in West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, instead of this kind of push towards rice, maize, wheat. What about sorghums? What about the millets? What about the phonios and the tefts and the pigeon peas and all the different sort of very traditional crops? If some of you don't know this, sorghum and millet are indigenous to Africa, as is coffee, among many other things. But there's a big push to re-energize some of these traditional crops and how can they be used in modern cuisine, etc. So yeah, I think it's an exciting moment for it's Africa's such a diverse continent of cuisine and people and culture. and how, you know, amplifying that diversity in positive ways is really important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
You are the foodiest of foodies. So
Can't see.
I don't know if you, can you all still hear me?
Not really. I see Maya's comment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You all hear me? I'm in a little bit of a drop zone. Is that better?
A little bit.
Yeah, it's a little bit better. We missed some of what you were saying, something about the foodiest of foodies, but I don't know.
I was saying Dr. Fanzo is the foodiest of foodies.
Oh.
We just
Oh, can't hear her.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit again.
okay.
I can take over. Yeah, any other questions, thoughts?
Hi,
I
Jess,
sort
thank
of
you.
appreciate.
Oh.
Oops, sorry. Go ahead, Casey.
You can
Sorry.
go ahead, Maya. I know you had several comments. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna, my quick comment was just, I think sometimes when we're thinking about talking with diverse populations about like nutrition and health, I think it's important to kind of sort of center culture and to adjust the way that we have the dialogue to sort of not artificially sort of impose our views on other
Yeah.
populations and sort of help them see, okay, well, hey, there is a way that you can retain your cultural values, your something along those lines or whatever, but also help you to find or identify something that still has a value for your population that maybe tastes similarly or whatever, but still sort of holds true or whatever, so it doesn't feel like you're losing out on something. I think sometimes when with migration or mobility or whatever, we sort of make populations or require of populations to lose parts of themselves or whatever to assimilate. And sort of, I think it's really nice to kind of think about ways in which we can create that populations can be who they are or whatever, but adopt processes that allow for them to just sort of make tweaks or refinements or whatever that help them be their healthiest possible or whatever, but still hold true to what is most meaningful for them. And so that's sort of what I meant by my comment.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Yeah. And I think we can see the movement of people around the world, you know, whether they are displaced or forced or voluntarily moving, that can add incredible richness to food systems if they bring those cultures along. And so there's a whole kind of need to respect those new, you know, cultures as they you know, as if they're coming into another territory or country. You know, it's this idea of bringing that all together and respecting those traditions. Yeah. Casey, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Really interesting and raised a lot of important issues. I was thinking about the U.S. dietary guidelines, and in one of their recent iterations, the scientific community wrote their advisory report and consulted people on sustainability concerns. And then it never quite made it into the dietary guidelines. And so I was wondering, you know, what's your opinion on how the US values the issue of sustainability and making recommendations for dietary guidelines? And
Yeah.
do you see this changing?
No. Oh, that's it. That's all I have to say. No, I mean, I don't. Not in the, it's too contentious politically. I mean, in the last several rounds of the dietary guidelines that happen every 5 years when the US comes up with these dietary guidelines and goes through a scientific process, you know, they attempted to insert environmental sustainability. I can't remember which round that was. Maybe it was the 2015 I don't know if it was in the 2020 even.
Yeah, I can't
Different
remember which cycle it
administration.
was.
But you know, in the 2025, that was quickly shut down. That will not be considered again. You know, we're the only country in the world that has had moments where we've had climate denialists. We're the only country in the world. I mean, having worked in 2 UN agencies, you sometimes see US in these UN negotiations, and you know, they're very careful in their wording about climate change, where all the other member states and countries are just like, what is wrong with the US? Why are they not getting that we're in the middle of climate change? And when the Trump administration was happening, I sometimes had to go to Capitol Hill and do some hearings, and I was asked to not use the words climate change. I used them anyway. You know, I mean, come on. But it's one of the few countries in the world where you see this, what becomes a scientific, a sure scientific, evidence-based, long known issue, quickly gets into cultural and political wars. It was the same with COVID, right? You know, 45 years ago, climate scientists presented to the US government that the world was warming, and that Jim Hansen, he's actually at Columbia, that it was human induced. And they did nothing. The US government did nothing. There's a great book about it. I think the author is Nathaniel Rich. And, you know, it's the same thing with the dietary guidelines. Like, how many iterations will it take before we think about the planet and our health when it comes time to food? And a lot of countries are doing that. Germany just released their dietary guidelines, more plant-based. Canada, Qatar, a lot of countries have moved towards this healthy and sustainable diets, but the US is very behind on this. Isn't that incredible, Casey? It's really incredible.
Yeah, it's just pretty disappointing when you have, you know, people who are selected to be the, you know, brightest scientists on these topics making recommendations, and just whole sections being left out.
Yeah.
So it's disappointing.
Yes, it is. I hope you all can hear me now. Sorry for the connection issue. I wanted to the last couple moments here, wondering, Dr. Fanzo, if you could give us since we have a number of people who are joining today who are they may be trainees or very early in their career. How would like, what sort of training would you advise for people who might want to pursue this big, hairy, and audacious problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think taking some kind of a food systems class, you know, there's several at Hopkins. Ronnie Neff teaches on food systems. I think, you know, there's a few. Andrew Thorne Lyman teaches an international food policy class, I think. I think taking a climate class is very informative. I mean, climate's going to affect all of us in all of our sectors and disciplines. You know, if you're not in food at all, but you're in health, it's definitely going to impact the health of populations. I think a climate class is always good to take. You know, what do we mean when we talk about climate change? What's climate variability? What's extreme events? What's mitigation, adaptation? I think understanding a basic class in that is important, because we're going to be moving into a decade where climate will have significant impacts on all of us personally and professionally. So I think understanding that and what that means is really important. Yeah, I mean, and just being exposed to coming to talks like this is fun. You know, getting out of your comfort zone is always good. Listening to podcasts, you know, just expose yourself to different different kinds of information. Yeah. And there's a, you know, a whole range of great classes at Hopkins on food. And now you have a new planetary health center. I can't remember, Deidre,
Yeah,
what that
Institute for Planetary Health.
You got
Yeah.
Sam Myers there. He's one of the best in this space. You know, see if he's teaching, and he's a medical doctor, so he has an interesting background. Yeah, so Hopkins is sort of a good place to get that systems sort of training.
Well, we appreciate that. Well, this has really been wonderful. As we all said, very sobering, but we appreciate you for the work that you do, and also just even the way you communicate it as well. It's really wonderful. So thank you. Please, everyone, please join me again in thanking Dr. Fanzo, and we look forward to seeing all of you again in May for our jam session in May. So enjoy the nice day, the nice weather out.
Great.
Thanks
Thanks for
again.
having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.